Welcome to week 12 of the semester. This week we begin the fifth and final module. We will cover chapters 12, 13, 14, and 15 in the remaining weeks. This week we're going to cover part 1 of a 2-part lecture. We are going to learn about the history of mental illness treatment. We have a lot of information to cover in this lecture in both part 1 and part 2. This week, we're going to start with an exploration of what the treatment of mental illness was like before the reforms of the Enlightenment period. If you choose to do option 1 of the week 12 discussion board, then you have a jump start on this first question. We will also look at the contributions of many people in this lecture. We'll look at the reformers, Pinel, Tuke, Kirkbride, Dix, and Beers. We will also look at hypnotism and its impact on psychoanalysis. We'll look at the contributions of Sigmund Freud and his daughter Anna Freud, and we will also consider the work of Alfred Adler and Carl Jung. I want to start with a brief overview of how mental illness has been treated historically. This timeline is meant to depict how mental illness has been treated, studied, thought about over the years. Before the late 1700s, mental illness was thought to be incurable. And individuals who were said to have mental illness were not treated humanely according to today's standards. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Throughout the 1800s, treatment was reformed. There were a number of individuals who worked very hard to make major changes to the way we think about, the way we talk about, the way we treat individuals suffering from mental illness. Then in the early 1900s, a new treatment option, psychoanalysis, was developed and promoted widely across treatment centers. By the mid-1900s, there were a variety of treatment options, including psychoanalysis, but also including things like electroconvulsive therapy and lobotomies, as well as behavioral modification therapies and humanistic psychology. Today, mental illness is the least stigmatized it has ever been. The treatment of mental illness is talked about more publicly now today than ever before. We still have a long way to go, in my opinion, but there has been a dramatic shift in the last 50 years in terms of the general public's willingness to consider mental illness as a top priority. Let me explain in a little bit more detail on the next few slides. Before the reforms of the 1800s, mental illness was generally thought to be untreatable, and those who were said to have a mental illness were thought to be deviant and even crazy. In fact, for most of recorded history, mental illness has not been treated at all. Individuals with mental illness have largely been neglected by society, by their family members even. They have been confined to their homes, prisons, basements of hospitals. For many years, we had very few institutions that were willing to treat people with mental illness. If you take a look at the discussion board option 1, you can see some of the inhumane treatments that were often used to address these individuals of society. Unfortunately, they were sometimes chained up, sometimes tortured, experimented on, and even killed in some instances. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, the Enlightenment period began. Along with this, the treatment of mental illness also began to change. There were several people who made large contributions to these reforms. We're going to talk about a handful of them in this lecture. Philippe Pinel, William Tuke, Thomas Kirkbride, Dorothea Dix, and Clifford Beers. So let's take a look at each one of these individuals briefly and see what they did to make a big enough difference in the treatment of mental illness to find themselves in the history books. We will take a look at the contributions of each one of these individuals in a few minutes. By the early 1900s, mental illness was viewed as more biologically based and thus generally treatable. More and more people were realizing that individuals with mental illness did not need to be separated from society, did not need to be confined to the basement. They were treatable. There were multiple options beginning to develop, and one of those options was psychoanalysis. Its inventor was Sigmund Freud. His daughter Anna Freud used it with children, and then Alfred Adler and Carl Jung took Freud's version of psychoanalysis and created their own versions. Then in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, several medical approaches like lobotomies and insulin therapy became more available to the public. And so those options were commonly used in the middle of the 1900s. Then in the 1950s and the 1960s, after World War II, psychology again underwent another transition, and both behaviorism and humanistic psychology began to dominate the treatment of mental illness. And the medical approaches from the 1950s began to fall out of favor as pharmaceutical companies came up with yet another option in the 1970s and 80s.